what we've talked about so far has mostly been the things on the left side of the screen. The only thing I didn't really mention here is this navigation bar. You can use that to move between scenes. You'll notice that I have this landing page set up and this town scene that we've been using for the tutorial videos. I also haven't mentioned this players window in the bottom. You'll notice if I pop this out, all of the players that are on this particular Foundry world. And I can also set up user configuration to change who owns what. As a DM, I have access to every token on the server as it is named, so it is very cluttered. You'll also notice that there's a macros folder here. We're not really going to worry about those macros right now. One thing I did do when I set up the server was I added the dice roll macros, which are handy. I have those hotbars. If I ever need to roll dice, I can just hit those hotkeys, and you'll see those dice rolls appear. You can also set those to be private GM rolls, so if I wanted to roll something that only DMs could see, and you'll notice it says who can see this, I could roll it that way. I could also roll a blind GM roll, and I can also just self-roll so that only I can see, no one else can. So a blind GM roll looks the same to me as a GM as it would to any GM. If I were a player doing a blind GM roll, what it would do is I would send the roll and only the GM would see it. So that is the differentiation there, I believe. And then you can also export the chat log or delete it. I'm going to clear that because I've spammed it with a bunch of macros. But you certainly can do that. That brings us to this right sidebar, which is the chat log. The chat log is extremely self-explanatory. We basically just discussed all you do there. There are some modules you can use that are extensible for this, but we will not talk about those today. We'll focus on things that are default. And now the combat tracker. This scene is not particularly set up for the combat tracker right now. So I will go to my actors directory and add in 2 of my retired characters to the scene real quick so that we can have them fight each other in a mock combat. To add creatures to the combat encounter, you need to mark them as being in combat. So you can do so by hitting toggle combat state here. That is how you will add them to the combat list. You'll notice here that I have another icon that's from Argon HUD that is not relevant to this. Now that I have creatures in the combat tracker, there are a couple different ways to handle that. This button will roll for all. This button will roll for NPCs. Both of these are set to be player characters, but they have no owners, so they will roll as NPCs. If there were a player present to which these tokens were assigned, if I clicked that button, it would not roll. So that is a way to roll initiative without having it impact your players if they want to roll their own initiative. You can hit roll NPCs, it will roll all your NPCs at once. You have a bunch of NPCs, it will be very loud. But that certainly is one way you can do it. You can also reset initiative. So let's say there's a brief lull in fighting and then more enemies show up and you want your players to re-roll, you can do that. There's also combat tracker settings. That's something that you can do to track, say, HP values. Skip defeated also bypasses combatants marked as defeated. That is something that generally you have to do manually. You can also do that with more customization. So you see that one of my former characters has an HP value of 85 and the other has 96. I have some modules set up, particularly MIDI call that handle automation. So if I hop over to this guy and Eldritch Blast my sorcerer, you'll notice that his HP value updates in that log. And if I cast Mind's Liver, that won't actually do anything because the automation is currently broken for that. Ignore that. That is something I need to work on. But that would have possibly done some damage. And so that's the brief rundown of the combat tracker. Then when you're done, you can either delete the encounter, which will clear it out, or if you have hit the begin combat, you can also hit end combat, which will do the same thing. You'll notice it'll say no active tracker. You can actually add multiple encounters in a scene. So if you, say, have people fighting 2 different places, you could add a token to one encounter, and then one to the next. You'll notice that they have different initiatives. So if they were in 2 different buildings fighting, I could say, okay, we're going to do one building at a time and then the next building. And that way it will be a bit neater than trying to jump back and forth between 2 different places. These are per scene, so if you have multiple scenes with combat encounters, they will not track across scenes, including following initiative values. So if you're going to move a token from one scene to another, say a player character comes up some stairs, you'll want to make sure that you remember what their initiative value was, that they stay in the right place without getting disrupted, unless you You can't just roll up through the chat log to find that initiative role. If you hop back to the chat log, you'll notice some of these come from MIDI call automation. You'll notice that these initiative roles did track in the combat tracker or in the chat log, so it's not like it's going to go away or anything. And that will cover the chat log, the combat tracker, and the last few things we didn't discuss in the top left. That wraps us up for now. You'll notice that there's some tools over here that are for DMs. I probably should have mentioned those earlier, but these are mostly irrelevant for what we're discussing. They're basic functions. The select tokens, target tokens, and measure distance is basically the same as it is for players. So with that, I will see you when we start talking about scenes.